Hello and welcome to Talking Europe. The West is keen to show unity in the face of Russia and China, but trade tensions between the US and the EU risk undermining that effort. Europe is bracing for the impact of US subsidies on its own industries. But it's important to hear the American perspective on this issue as well. So I'm pleased to be with the US ambassador to the EU in this program. Mark Gitenstein took up the position almost exactly a year ago, and it proved to be a baptism of fire with the war in Ukraine beginning just a few weeks into his job, and it has, of course, dominated his work ever since. Ambassador Gitenstein, thank you so much for being my guest on this program, and thanks for hosting us at the embassy here. So let's start with the situation in Ukraine and all the intelligence indicating a possible Russian spring offensive. How seriously is the US taking that prospect, and how prepared do you think the US and the EU are if that takes place?
Well, first of all, Armand, thank you and France 24 for having me. It's a privilege to be able to talk about these important issues. You know, everybody's concerned about Ukraine and what's going on there. I think what happens in Ukraine is largely a function of two things: the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people and their fighters, which is awe-inspiring, to be frank, and the ability of the United States and her allies, especially in the European Union, to provide the equipment necessary for them to win this war. And I have every confidence that they are. It'll be difficult. There'll be lives lost. There'll be brutal destruction of civilian infrastructure and property and energy infrastructure. But in the end, I am convinced the Ukrainians will win this with the weapons that we're providing.
A group of US senators is saying that the administration should do more, go beyond supplying tanks. What do you think about that?
I've talked to a lot of senators, and I've talked to Republicans and Democrats alike. And what I come away from those discussions with, and even those who you might expect to be skeptics, saying to us is they will continue to support this effort as long as the Ukrainians are successful on the ground. And I think the evidence so far has been pretty impressive, and they have been successful on the ground. And we've been providing, I think we just sent over the last year at least $40 billion worth of military equipment of all kinds of technology to the Ukrainian military, and they've used it very effectively. You know, there are logistical problems getting the material into a war zone, and I think we've been successful in that regard. I think it's hard to imagine how we could get any more equipment in there any faster.
Just on the balance of burden sharing on both sides of the Atlantic, the EU has now surpassed the US in total committed aid to Ukraine. That's according to the Ukraine Support Tracker. That, of course, agglomerates all the different kinds of aid. If you look at purely military aid, the US is obviously still by far the largest donor. Do you think the EU should be doing more on the military front, or perhaps specific countries doing more on the military side?
Well, there are specific countries that could be doing more, I'm sure, without getting into names. But I think we are doing a huge lion's share of the military contributions in particular, although there are other countries that are doing quite well themselves. I think this comparison of who's doing what is a little bit apples and oranges, because it doesn't measure the energy costs that Europeans are facing, or the impact of refugees, or the disruption that causes in their countries. I think the burden sharing has been pretty equal, quite frankly, if you consider all of those factors.
You talk to EU diplomats, of course, all the time. Do you get a sense that the EU's resolve is slightly faltering now, as we saw in the 9th package of sanctions on Russia? It wasn't just Hungary, but Belgium, Greece. There were other expressions of skepticism. Do you sense a slight change in the mood?
No. I'll give you the same answer. People always ask me how, is this sustainable? Well, the Europeans and Americans stick to their guns and fight this to the end, and I think they will. And I think they will primarily because of the work that you and your colleagues are doing in journalism and telling the story. Because you can't be an American citizen watching CNN in Washington, D.C. or Bismarck, North Dakota, or a European here in Brussels or in Bucharest and not see the brutality of this war and want to do something about it. And as long as that coverage is true and accurate and thorough, I think Europeans and Americans are going to support this effort, and they will not falter. I think it's, especially to Europeans, it's so close to home. And they feel the impact, and they want to do something about it, and they want their leaders to do something about it, and they are.
Let's talk about another big issue in transatlantic relations at the moment, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which your president has brought in. And I just wonder how do you see the EU response to that as it's shaping up now? Do you see a kind of race on subsidies on both sides of the Atlantic? Is that a real risk, do you think?
Let's reflect and go back up to 50,000 feet about what this is really about, okay? The Inflation Reduction Act is probably the largest commitment the U.S. government has ever made to fighting climate change. It's certainly the largest in our history. It may be the largest in the world ever done before. The Europeans are struggling with the same issues we are. They want to fight climate change. They want to abolish the combustion engine by 2035, just like we do. Well, if you're going to abolish the combustion engine, you have to have electric vehicles. If you have electric vehicles, you have to have electric batteries. You have to electric batteries, you have to have critical minerals. You have to build the supply chain and the infrastructure on both sides of the Atlantic to make this happen. And that's what the Inflation Reduction Act did, in particular on the electric vehicle provision. And I think the Europeans are struggling with the same issues, and they want to do the same thing. And they know that the critical mineral supply chain is in jeopardy now. So this is an energy security issue and a climate change issue, and we can accomplish both goals. Both systems can do this, and I think the Europeans are trying to do something very similar in the legislation that President von der Leyen has proposed.
I want to come back to electric vehicles, but just first on the current state of the talks between Washington and Brussels. Are things moving towards a compromise where European companies get some exemptions under the IRA?
I can only repeat what my president said, which is that there are some glitches in the statute that can be fixed via regulation and clarified via regulation. You know, in the most recent promulgation by the IRS, the IRS made it clear that commercial vehicles are not covered by these restrictions. There are other provisions in the white paper that they say are worth looking at, and we have a very formal regulatory process that's underway. For example, the definition of a free trade agreement. What does that mean? There are other provisions in the Act that are a little ambiguous. What won't happen is we're not going to change the statute. That is not going to happen. But there may be regulatory fixes that are possible. But in the long run, it's important that both sides of the Atlantic get on the same page as to what they're trying to do, and I think that's what President von der Leyen is trying to do with her proposal.
You mentioned electric vehicles, which is obviously a very important part of this whole story. If we see a situation where Europe starts increasing subsidies to its own electrical car production, given that there's a lot more of that here than in the US, is that going to be seen then as unfair competition by the US? Because these things are kind of mirror images.
No, they are mirror images of each other in the sense that we have to build the infrastructure on both sides of the Atlantic to assemble cars and assemble batteries and get critical minerals. Well, you know, the problem is in both Europe and the United States, we don't have the infrastructure in place right now to even mine enough critical minerals to supply the batteries or the battery assembly, and we're creating incentives to do that, and we have to do that. We have no choice if we're going to get to this goal of abolishing the combustion engine by 2035, and we want to do it in a way that doesn't depend entirely, for example, on the PRC, which has built an infrastructure and a critical mineral infrastructure, and they have different values than we do. We want an independent supply chain. If we've learned anything in the last 2 or 3 years is that having an independent supply chain is critical to our national security.
Just a slightly more personal question, if I may. You've known President Biden since the 1970s. Your families know each other very well as well. I'm just curious, does that have any specific sort of added value for you in this job as the US ambassador to the EU?
Only in that I think I know how he thinks about issues, and I can anticipate where he's probably going to go on an issue. And I think I often am sitting in a meeting and I'm thinking, what would President Biden do in this circumstance? And I'm pretty sure I have a good sense of what that would be, but beyond that, no, I don't. You'd be surprised how little I talk with him about policy issues. If we get together, it's often about personal issues. There's a whole apparatus set up in terms of policy positions. I'm not a policy maker, I'm an implementer of policy. So,
but if you sort of know how he thinks, then you don't have to talk to him as much, I suppose, as someone who doesn't know him.
No, I think he chose me because we share the same values, and I certainly believe we do. So I'm proud to be in this position, but it doesn't give me any special access, and I certainly don't try and use it that way. Yeah.
Ambassador Gitenstein, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Okay, good.
Well, that's all for part one of the programme. Do join me after the break. I'll be at the European Parliament here in Brussels with my panel of MEPs, and we'll be talking more about this possible subsidies clash between the EU and the US.